Hello everybody, welcome back to the Art and Storytelling Guild. By the time you watch this video, you've probably worked your way up to the very top of the story pyramid. You've already learned about the setting, the characters, and the overall plot of your story. So now we can start to get a little bit more detailed. From this point on, we're going to be handling more specific topics, like genres of stories, dialogue, and stuff like that. So let's get started. So the topic we're going to be covering today is character arcs. And character arc is just a fancy term for the individual plots that happen that just apply to specific characters. There's one big grand plot that affects every character in your story, but your characters are likely going to be unique individuals that react to situations differently and have different thoughts on different things. So each character is going to go through their own journey, whether that's a physical journey, an emotional journey, a moral journey, whatever it is. They're all going to be a little bit different. Some characters have really big changes happen to them, and those big changes are mostly what character arcs are about. Now, to understand character arcs, we have to go a little bit deeper into characters as a whole. There are lots of different types of characters, and what type of character a character is can affect the kind of arc that they go through. So let's look at some of them now. So no matter what kind of character you're talking about, whether it's the protagonist, the antagonist, side characters, mentors, whatever, there are 4 terms that are used to categorize characters. And these are flat, round, static, and dynamic. So let's go through each one. So these first 2 terms, flat and round, those two are kind of opposites. A flat character is a character that you don't know much about them or who they are as a person, and they're designed to be that way. They're meant to be taken at face value and nothing more. An example of this type of character would be like a baker that hands the protagonist a loaf of bread, and that's it. You're not meant to find out anything more than that person is a baker, and that's it. And that character has served their purpose. They didn't need to be anything more than the baker that hands them a loaf of bread. Now, the opposite of that is a round character. Round characters are characters that you know a lot about them. You know where they're from, what they act like, what they look like. You have a lot of information given about them. And this character can be the hero, it can be the villain, it can even be one of the side characters if they're really important to the story. An easy way to remember this is that a flat character you can only look at from one side. A round character, you can look at him from a bunch of different angles and still see the same character. And a character can only be one of these 2 things. It can't be both a flat and a round character. Now let's move on to static and dynamic characters. Now in other contexts, static means not moving and dynamic means moving a lot. So you can probably guess what these kinds of characters are. A static character is a character that does not change throughout the entire story. This could be like a villain that starts out evil, remains evil through the entire story, and at the end, they're still evil. These kinds of characters don't go through any sort of character arc. Dynamic characters, on the other hand, are the ones that we're going to be looking at today. Dynamic characters experience some sort of change over the story. It can be a little change, it can be a big change, but they change somehow. An example of this could be a villain that is evil at the beginning, but the hero convinces them to convert to the good side. So they go through a personal change where they change their morals and their actions. Now, like flat and round characters, these 2 terms are opposites, and a character can't be both at the same time. It can't be both a static character and a dynamic character. However, you can mix these terms together from the different groups. You can have a flat static character, or you can have a flat and dynamic character. You can have a round and static character, and you can have a round and dynamic character. Now, in the character arcs we're going to be learning about today, no matter if the character is round or flat, they have to be dynamic because they have to go through some sort of change to fit into one of these arcs. So let's go ahead and look at the first type of character arc. We'll start out with the transformation arc. This arc is usually reserved for the protagonist of your story, but some storytellers have chosen to use it for the villain instead, which can be effective if done correctly. But it is most commonly used for the hero, because this arc is all about going from a regular person to a high-powered or strong and often kind of heroic kind of person. By the end of the story, this character is usually completely different than the person they were at the beginning, and this kind of change is usually very irreversible. An example of this might be Bilbo or Frodo Baggins in the Lord of the Rings series. They were average hobbits at the beginning of the series, but by the end, they really couldn't go back to that kind of quiet life. And again, this doesn't have to be just for the hero. This arc can actually be very effective for a villain if that villain thinks that they are doing the right thing or thinks that they are the hero or protagonist. You can create a very good story if you go against conventional expectations like this. So on that note, let's now go to the arc that's all about going against the expectation of the character themselves. And this would be the growth arc. And growth arcs are definitely the most versatile of all the character arcs because you can really use them for any character. The protagonist, the side characters, the villain, it doesn't matter. This arc can really be used for anybody. And this arc is very well named because it's exactly what it sounds like. The character experiences some sort of growth throughout the story. They sort of realize their potential as a person. For a side character that's often seen as very weak or shy, this can mean like a moment of truth where they have to stand up to the villain and they finally realize that they're actually a super good fighter or super brave. For your antagonist, this arc usually comes in the form of redemption. They realize the error of their ways, they realize they've been hurting people, and that what they're doing isn't right, and they make an effort to become better. And that really is what this arc is all about, making an effort to be a better person, whatever that means to the characters. And this can happen over the entire course of your story. It can be something that you hint at the beginning that's really just working in the background, or it can happen, like I said, in a very stressful situation, a moment of truth, where they have to realize their full potential. And just by nature, this arc really makes for a very heartwarming, nice, happy ending. Now, this last arc that we'll look at isn't quite so nice and happy. And this is called the fall arc. It's kind of the opposite of the growth arc that we just looked at. Rather than changing for the better, characters that experience this arc change for the worse. This usually happens because a character commits an act that isn't morally right, or maybe they commit several acts that aren't right. This arc can also happen if the character doesn't handle a high-stress situation very well. Maybe they crack under the pressure and end up doing something that hurts their friends rather than helps them. Either way, in a metaphorical sense, not a literal sense, this character would end up falling. So rather than in the last one where a bad guy would become a good guy, in a fall arc, a good guy would become a bad guy. And all of these arcs that we've discussed have a huge effect on your story as a whole, because they shift the balance of power. If it helps, let's think about this like Star Wars, where there's a light side and a dark side. In the transformation arc, a character that previously had no affiliation to dark or light ends up picking a side, whether that is the dark or the light side. In a growth arc, if a villain becomes the protagonist, then the dark side loses power and the light side gains power. Or if a weak light side character gets stronger, then the light side still gains power. In a fall arc, the light side loses power and the dark side gains power. And the shifting of this balance can affect your story in a major way. On a smaller level, it means that the protagonist or protagonists will face different challenges, maybe more or less difficult challenges depending on which side has more power. On a bigger level, it'll affect the plot as a whole. The difference in power between your light and dark sides will A, affect how hard it is for one side to win, and B, affect which side wins at all. So to create a more compelling plot, it's important to understand how these forces interact with each other and change over the course of your story. So now let's talk about your activity for today. As always, I would love to see you make progress on your written story, but today I want you to make time for a more art-centered activity as well. If you'll remember when we first talked about characters, we talked about how you can clue your viewer in to your character's personality or who they are through their appearance, through things like body language, their clothing, and just everything about them. So today I want you to pick one of your characters, decide what kind of arc that they're going to go through, and then draw them before their arc and after their arc. And be sure to add in clues about what happens to them. You can see on screen that in the before section, we had a villainous character that went through a growth arc and became a heroic character. I want you guys to try and communicate the same sort of change in your characters. So I'll see you all back on the Hangout at 2:40, and I can't wait to see what you've created.